So now that I have the basic bearings inside Unity and I understand object orientation and I can make some materials and lights, and next thing I want to do is start to experiment with the physics engine inside Unity. And what that will do is we can declare objects to be governed by the physics engine and allow them to be kind of pushed around or fall, be pulled by gravity, that sort of thing. And in this project, we just want to create an experimental scene and drop some stuff into the physics engine and see if we can create kind of a fun experimental animation based on the physics engine. And so in order to get this next phase of the project started, what I'll do is I'll create a game object, and this time I'll choose sphere. Now I'm going to lift that sphere up, and I'm going to change my perspective just a little bit. As I lift that up along the y-axis, I can see that that's overlapping the space with the cube or the bumper object that I have here, and that's just fine. But if I want these objects to line up, I can be mindful of their position in space by looking at their position, their transform position component. So what I'll do is I'll zero out the X value, hit the tab key. I'll leave the Y to whatever it is now because that's going to be dynamic. That's something that I'm going to move later. I'll tab over to the Z and I'll type in 0. And now I know those objects are lined up in space because my cube was at 0 along the X and 0 along the Z. So as I lift that up, I can just kind of pick that up and move it through, and I can see that those are occupying the same space, and I'll just lift that up a little bit more. I'm going to look at this through the game view by hitting the play button. Now when I look at this, I'm looking through the camera. I can see the bottom of this ball or this sphere right now. I'll probably recompose my camera a little bit later, but I know that ball is just kind of, or that sphere is hanging in space. Let me toggle the play button off. I'll even rename this sphere. I'll call it ball. And if I want this ball to be influenced by the physics engine, it's very easy to do. All I need to do is select the ball. With the ball selected, I'll go to Components, Physics, and I'll add a rigid body to this object. Now, when I do this, I want you to pay attention to what happens over here in the inspector panel because we're going to get an additional component. Currently, this ball object has a transform component, a sphere mesh, sphere collider, mesh render, and a default texture component. When I choose component, physics, rigid body, you can see that I now have a rigid body component that's been added to the sphere. It has a massive one, it has 0 drag, and it has some other parameters here that we can start to influence. And now when I hit the play button, Unity knows that this object is being used by the physics engine, or it's paying attention to the physics inside the scene, and it immediately falls to the ground. Well, in this case, it falls to the bumper, and it just stops right where it's at. Let me toggle the play button and go back to my scene. If I take my bumper and I rotate this a little bit, so I change the angle of that top polygon here, I'll just go to rotation, and I'll rotate this along, let me rotate it along the X just a little bit. So I'll tip that in space. Maybe I'll rotate it to 10 degrees along the X. Now when I hit the play button, that ball will roll off, and it rolls off onto the ground, and then of course it drops out into space because my scene is not completely composed at this point. So I'm going to select my camera, and I'm going to get a better sense of where the camera is looking. So I'm going to zoom out, I'm going to change my perspective, and I can see that I'm looking down at the cube here, and I've pitched that cube back away from the camera. I want to change the rotation of the bumper so that it's not pitching away from the camera. I want it to kind of tip away from the side, from a side or a profile of the camera. So I can look through the camera preview and do this, but I got a better sense of what the orientation of my scene is. I'm going to go back to the bumper. I'm going to zero out the X value, and this time I'll do it along Z. So depending on how you have your scene composed, these values may not work for you. And that's really what this project is about, is experimenting, trying to figure out where the camera is relative to the rest of the objects inside the scene. So I can also scale this object along its X scale. So I'll go to X and I'll just scale that up and make it a little bit wider. I'm going to reduce the scale of the Y to kind of make this read a little bit more like a ramp. And now let me hit the play button again. Okay, so now I have just this real basic physics setup. I'm going to extend the ground plane as well, so I'll choose the floor or the ground plane, And instead of having this 10 along the X, I'll change it to 50. That might be a little big, but it'll give us some room to play with. I'll hit the play button again. Okay, so I got a real simple, very simple animation going. Just have a ball rolling off into the scene. And so now I could keep adding objects. Let me take the size of my ground plane or my floor plane down. Maybe I'll change it to 20. Now that seems a little bit more manageable. So I have this simple bumper object, and I could move that around in space. I'll take my ball object and I'll move that up and over. And I'll take that bumper, I'll right click on it and I'll duplicate it. And now I have an exact duplicate of that bumper. It inherited its same position, and so I'll just move it up a little bit. I'll move it over as well. And I'm just going to change the rotation from -10 to +10. So I'll have it kind of rotate back or tip back towards the other direction. I'll go grab that original bumper object, the lower one, and just duplicate that as well. So I can right click and choose to duplicate, or I can have it selected and use Command D to duplicate. That does the same thing. And so I'll just kind of move this, just eyeballing it. I'm only moving it to one axis by one axis at a time. And I'll grab that ball object and I'll move that up as well. So I'll grab my main camera because I won't be able to see the entire scene the way that it's composed now, and I'll lift that camera up a bit. And I'm just looking through my preview. There we go. I'm not crazy about where these shadows are falling. It's not, you know, it's not working with the composition of the scene, but I'll change that later by rotating the directional lights. Let me hit play and test this again. So this real simple setup of this ball kind of bouncing across these bumpers. It eventually gets spit out, and maybe I'll set up some stuff that ball can knock over towards the end of the end of this animation. So that's the basic way to implement the physics engine. Just a real quick review. I'll delete my ball object and I'll recreate that very quickly. I'm going to go to Game Objects, Create Other. I'll choose Sphere. I'm going to lift that sphere up. I'm going to make sure that in this case, I was very conscious of creating those bumper cubes at 0 along the X and 0 along the Z to ensure that I get these objects to line up. I'm just going to zero out the X and the Z position of my sphere, and I'll move that into a more appropriate place. With that sphere selected, I'll go to Components, Physics, Rigid Body. And at that point, I have this rigid body component where I can affect these parameters. We'll play with those in a later presentation, but for now, I have this real simple setup of this sphere just kind of rolling through space and bouncing off these real simple planes that I have set up. Now in later projects, we'll start to influence things based on physics, but for now, we just want to experiment and see what kinds of things that we can come up with to create a real simple animation using the physics engine. So I could do things like I'll throw another object into the scene. I'll just take a simple cube and I'll move that into a position that I think will intersect with this sphere. I'm going to take that cube and maybe I'll scale it up along the y-axis a bit. So I'll scale it up to 3 or maybe 2. I'm going to make it a bit more narrow along the x and the z, so I'm making it tall and narrow. I'll just lift that up above the ground just a little bit. It looks like it'll line up. And now with that new cube selected, if I go to Components, Physics, Rigid Body, that object is now paying attention to the physics engine in Unity. So what'll happen when I hit the play button is that cube will fall to the ground and stand up. And when the ball comes down, it'll knock over that cube. So I'll hit play. The suspense is killing me. And there we go. Real simple physics engine setup. I'm going to continue to experiment, play around with this. In the next presentations, we'll look at some of the other physics components. We'll play with some of these parameters. We'll take a look at other components that we may be able to implement to make this even a little bit more exciting, but we'll do that in the next presentation. For now, set up a really simple experiment, throw a sphere into the equation, add a rigid body to it, and see what you can do. See how you can experiment, see if you can make a fun, compelling, gravity-based animation. We'll catch up in the next presentation.